Frostpunk is cold, it is harsh, and it is unforgiving. It's a game about the struggle to survive the day, the determination to make it through the night, and the hope to build a better tomorrow. In this review, we will be taking a look at 11-Bit Studios' latest finished title, a city builder choked full of atmosphere, emotional resonance, and moral ambiguity. A rare combination of traits that has made Frostpunk an underrated gem. With development and content expansion ending in late 2020, we finally have the opportunity to review the entirety of the game's catalogue in its definitive and critically acclaimed bundle. This is Frostpunk, the Game of the Year Edition review. Polish company 11-Bit Studios are an independent developer-publisher known for their morally challenging games. Their most remarkable title before Frostpunk was the critically acclaimed This War of Mine, a strategic shelter-building sim that followed the perspective of citizens trying to survive in a war-torn, besieged city, pursuing their own stories and traversing their struggles. Its examination of the human condition, questioning of players' morality, and a grim, dark atmosphere has been received enthusiastically, with the game even added into a recommended reading list for Polish high schools. It's with this direction that 11-Bit Studios have brought to Frostpunk, a game that tasks the player to lead some of humanity's last remaining cities during a global catastrophe that has plunged the Earth into a new ice age. It's a novel mix of survival sim, city builder, and resource management packed into a steampunk, alternate historical, late Victorian setting. The game released in April of 2018 and was followed by a season pass which introduces 3 new DLCs. As a result, this review will cover the base game including all of its 3 DLCs, the Rifts DLC released in August 2019, the Last Autumn DLC released in January of 2020, and the final DLC On the Edge released in August of 2020. Frostpunk takes place in an alternate historical period during late 19th century. A series of catastrophic events have plunged global temperatures, triggering a breakdown of society and leading to millions of deaths. Like in This War of Mine, the lore of Frostpunk is intentionally kept vague and open-ended. There isn't any direct storytelling or narration besides opening cutscenes. Instead, anecdotal snippets of information are scattered throughout the game world, allows players to piece together the lore. This has led to numerous theories and interpretations about Frostpunk's setting, but there are general consensus referencing actual real-world events. Frostpunk is very much inspired by, if not a direct allusion to, the steampunk genre. In the game's timeline, which diverges from our own around the early 19th century, sees British mathematician Charles Babbage successful in his completion of the first mechanical computer, the difference engine, something in which he failed in our real-world timeline. This would later evolve into the analytical engine, promoting the inventions of increasingly complex technology such as the steam core, which could extract immense amounts of energy from burning coal compared to typical steam engines, accelerating industrialization and prompting the British Empire to become the world's first superpower. This technology was eventually adopted by other world powers such as the United States. Steam cores will go on to feature as an important resource within Frostpunk. Resultingly, inventions such as the automatons were possible, towering metal behemoths powered by steam core technology and operated by autonomous mechanical computers, greatly improving society's industrial and agricultural output, and these are also featured in the game. Thus, Frostpunk's retro-futuristic aesthetic, centered around steam-powered machinery and industrial technology, draws heavily from steampunk, as well as its recurring themes of post-apocalypse, survival, class struggle, and progress at the cost of humanity. By 1886 in the game's timeline, global temperatures began to cool dramatically, leading to widespread crop failures and mass starvation. This period is named in the game as the Great Frost and is believed to have been caused by a combination of volcanic eruptions, the dimming of the sun, and a possible meteor strike. Indeed, many of these events reference actual historical events such as the Mount Tambora and Krakatoa eruptions, the Little Ice Age period of low solar activity, and the disintegration of Biela's comet. In Frostpunk, however, these events were catastrophic to Earth's climate, triggering a rapid period of cooling and glaciation, which eventually plummeted mean temperatures to around -20 degrees Celsius, enough to freeze over most of the world's oceans. As weather anomalies increased in severity and scientific expeditions concluded bleak prospects for Earth's climate, many world powers began constructing huge heat generators located in coal-rich areas of the Northern Hemisphere, in the event civilians needed to be evacuated. These generators are supermassive, coal-burning structures intended to provide enough warmth to sustain large populations through the endless winter, and are a major part of the Frostpunk gameplay experience. The British Empire in particular embarked on a massive effort to build a generator site for each of its major cities, such as London, Liverpool and Manchester. However, by the time of the evacuations, only a handful of sites were ready, and political inaction, insurrections and civil disorder caused many logistical issues that feature in the campaign's backstory. It is this premise that the player is thrust in. As a captain of one of these outpost cities, the player has the ability to issue build orders, designate resources, and write laws to ensure the survival of their city. In the meanwhile, inherent problems, worsening weather, public morale, and moral dilemmas will test the player's resolve at every turn. Frostpunk offers two modes of play: scenarios that take players through well-crafted missions which explore much of the game's well-written exposition and world building. This mode is Frostpunk's finest offering, as each scenario is very different in terms of gameplay experience and victory objectives, constantly challenging the player in unique ways each time. The second mode is a more sandbox-style endless mode, where players can build a city on several maps across various difficulty settings. There's obviously less scripted events and storytelling in this mode, however. Frostpunk's strategic style, post-apocalyptic nature, and emphasis on storytelling also means there's little room for creativity in city design and aesthetics. There are some public decorative items such as street lamps, squares, and gardens available in endless mode. Nevertheless, if you're after the promise of building cool-looking steampunk-themed cities, throw that idea out of the window because this just isn't that type of game. Eleven-Bit Studios' Liquid Engine delivers a very robust audio-visual experience, yet quite polished for a non-AAA game release. Frostpunk's graphics shines with its attention to detail and its use of lighting, despite showcasing an ambiance that is otherwise very colourless, since most of the time players will only see whitish snow and dark soot-covered buildings. The entire architectural aesthetic of the game is very much steampunk inspired and an impression of the Victorian industrial era. However, the physics engine with snow is the most impressive part. Snow will melt when heat enters an area and build up over time when it is gone, giving not only a realistic feel but a visual indication of areas that may need warming up. People will trudge through snow if sent to work outside the warm confines of the city, creating a trail that will disappear overnight. The user interface is typical of a city builder, with resources displayed on top, whilst gameplay interaction is on the lower portion of the HUD. There is of course a major emphasis on temperature, where it receives a prominent position in the top center of the screen. Frostpunk is elevated further with its music and sound design. There's really little hope here to begin with to survive in one of these cities, and thus Frostpunk's soundtrack is suitably melancholic and depressing. Sound plays an important role in the game, as the audio cues are another form of presenting information to the player. Blaring horns signal the beginning of work shifts.
Get going! Time to earn your bread.
Whilst the sound of frost indicates worsening temperatures.
Brace yourselves, cold is coming.
Players may also notice the mechanical groaning of the generator, indicating high stress levels and a possible imminent explosion. The combined audio-visual experience makes Frostpunk one of the most atmospheric and emotional city builders of recent memory. Endless snow and depressing music already usher a constant feeling of dread and sadness. This is further compounded by the extremely dire conditions of your citizens. Every art piece featured in the UI showcases cold and weary citizens living in grimy houses and toiling in greasy workplaces. Many events are geared towards portraying desperate and tragic stories, usually with the player having to resolve emotionally charged dilemmas. I swear, probably the happiest scene you'll find are the children playing around the generator. The innocence of youth. There is also interactivity with your citizens on a personal level. You can click on your citizens to see if they have a family or are alone in this world. Gameplay mechanics we'll explore further on will also carve out individual stories and gives the player an impetus to care about their people's plight. The game's smaller scope also helps in this regard, since you'll be in charge of only a small ragtag group of survivors, so every positive outcome feels like a monumental occasion. The UI will also post occasional quips from your citizens in relation to mood changes or certain events happening, helping to gauge the current morale and if you are in danger of being deposed. Even the UI of the main menu has elements of personal anecdotes. Frostpunk's appeal is therefore to the players after a more grounded, immersive city builder experience with a lot of emotional depth and a clear atmospheric identity. Frostpunk is a well-polished game and performs well on all systems. It's not a particularly demanding game, it has to be said, as its scope is quite small, more on the scale of dozens of people on a small map rather than the scale of thousands you tend to see in other more ambitious city building games. Furthermore, I've never personally gotten a crash in my entire playtime of Frostpunk since its 2018 release. Going through online forums, there also doesn't seem to be much in the way of major technical complaints, so the conclusion seems to be that Frostpunk is a very stable game. For a city building game that has a modest focus, it has a surprising amount of depth in its gameplay. In saying that, Frostpunk is not an easy game, but lends itself well to being replayed, as players will learn from their mistakes and try better strategies next time around. Frostpunk's main stratagem revolves around the central generator, the heart of the city. It provides heat in a set radius around it by burning coal. Quite unique for a city builder is the game's building grid, which forms concentric circles around the generator. As a result, the idea is to try to maximize space as close to the center as possible to maximize the amount of heating provided by the generator. Later improvements allow you to improve the generator by increasing its heat radius and power level or reducing coal consumption and stress. Heat in this game is arguably the most important metric to control and is calculated in a level format where each heat level is denoted by 10 degrees Celsius and ranges from comfortable at 0 degrees to freezing temperatures at -50 and lower. Thus, each building has its own heat level, and this will be experienced by citizens if they live or work inside those respective buildings. Hence, it is imperative to keep heating levels high, as the morale of citizens and their chance of getting ill are affected by how comfortable the temperature is. Heat is obviously influenced by the outside weather and the generator, but other factors such as building insulation and researched improvements can also raise temperatures. There is a very handy UI filter explained before that quickly displays heat levels across all buildings. The heat system in conjunction with the weather system makes Frostpunk a very unique city builder, in which there is a constant external element players must continue to play around. A weather forecast is shown in the top right, which indicates any upcoming temperature changes over the next few days. In every game mode, the weather will begin at -20, but progressively get worse and worse over time, forcing the player to utilize more and more methods of raising heat levels. In Endless mode, there will be occasional blizzards which lower the temperature dramatically for a few days. Thus, long-term planning is key. In some instances, major storms may occur which can plummet the temperature below -100 degrees Celsius.
Brace yourselves, cold is coming.
Frostpunk is as much of a resource management game as it is a city builder. In Frostpunk's game world, which is sometimes mentioned as Frostland, resources are scarce and survival of your city rests on shrewd oversight. There are 6 major resources available at the beginning of the game. Coal is arguably the most important as it is used by the generator to produce heat. Later improvements such as steam hubs and building heaters also consume coal. However, it is also the most readily available since the generator sites have been chosen in areas rich in this resource. Thus, you can easily frack it to the surface with a coal thumper. Maps will usually also have 1 or 2 sites where you can build coal mines. Charcoal kilns can also be used to produce coal from charring wood. Wood and steel are the main construction materials and will be used for a host of various things throughout the game, though wood is usually needed more immediately in the early game and used more sparingly by the late game, vice versa for steel. Wood, however, is more easily procurable since there are usually groves of frozen trees around the starting area that can be processed with a sawmill. Later on, the wall drill can be researched, which uncovers wood from forest engulfed in the ice wall. However, there is usually only one site to build a wall drill and some maps don't have it at all. Steel, on the other hand, is produced at a very slow rate and can only be acquired by building a steelworks on a limited number of iron ore deposits. An extremely valuable resource are steam cores. These cannot be produced at all, but can be scavenged around the game world. Advanced late game buildings and automatons require steam cores to operate, so they are a strategic decision in their own right. Finally, there is raw food and food rations. A set amount of raw food can be hunted every night using a hunter's hut, which can be later upgraded to a hunter's hangar, deploying steampunk airships to more efficiently hunt prey. A more renewable food source is growing crops in a hothouse, though this is one of those buildings that requires a steam core to operate. Raw food can then be cooked into food rations in a cookhouse. People will prioritize eating rations, but if starving, will resort to eating raw food directly, much less resource efficient and increases their discontent. A city's population can also be somewhat considered a resource, and there are 3 classes of population: children, workers, and engineers. Children are restricted from working unless you enact child labor laws, but they can still be useful as apprentices in the opposite law branch. Workers are usually the most populous group and perform most of the labor requirements around your city. Engineers, on the other hand, perform the more advanced jobs, such as researching new technologies or curing patients as medics, but they can also be used to fulfill worker shortages in some other buildings such as mines or gathering posts. They are much more limited, however, and must be allocated in a shrewd manner. Making sure to not stretch your labor forces thin is one of the main facets of gameplay. Citizens also need to be housed, and building enough dwellings for everyone whilst keeping them warm will be a constant struggle. Homeless citizens will sleep near the generator at night and have a greater chance of falling ill. Citizens will follow a set schedule in the world of Frostpunk. The work shift begins at 8 AM and goes on until 6 PM. Outside these hours, citizens have free time and will go eat food at a cookhouse or sleep in their lodgings as they see fit, though some jobs such as hunters work overnight and thus have different schedules. Citizen health is directly related to the heat level. If your citizens work or sleep in below freezing temperatures, they have a risk of becoming ill. This risk increases by each colder heat level. Usually these will be smaller ailments that can be alleviated with medical posts, but working for extended periods of time in cold to freezing temperatures may incur frostbite, potentially requiring amputation and disabling the person. These invalids cannot work and their job position must be replaced, so it is definitely not a good idea to risk frostbite, and care must be made sure to keep your citizens as warm as possible. When sick, citizens will travel to their nearest medical post. However, the post only has 5 beds, and depending on how many engineers are assigned, takes some time for them to get better. As a result, making sure there are enough beds for patients is also another big part of the game. Otherwise, left too long and they can die from being untreated. Technological upgrades later on, such as the infirmary, allows engineers to heal more patients quicker, as well as being able to heal gravely ill patients, which the simple medical outpost can't do. Your citizens' morale is calculated through their discontent and hope. If either discontent rises too high or hope goes too low, then your session fails as you are exiled from the city. This is the main fail state of Frostpunk. Discontent and hope can fluctuate due to a variety of factors, from how cold people's homes are, to how overcrowded medical facilities are, to recent deaths among the population. Scripted or random story events also influence these parameters, sometimes to devastating effect. One of the methods for controlling morale is the Book of Laws, a major component of Frostpunk's gameplay experience. Providing tools to dictate the rules and direction of their city, the player is allowed to enact a new law every 18 to 45 hours, depending on the cooldown of their previous law. Laws chosen or disregarded will have a tremendous effect on the player's personal experience, as most laws aren't necessarily good or bad. They all have their own pros and cons. They also can't be reversed, so any decision is final. And every law has indirect consequences not obvious to the player until they play out later on. Initially, the player only has access to the adaptation branch. These laws allow the city to adapt to this cold, desolate environment just a bit more effectively, often intended to reduce discontent, raise hope, or do both. If your city is lacking in enough workers or not producing enough resources, consider signing child labor laws for safe jobs where they can work as resource gatherers or cooks. If you're still short for more labor, you can even force them to work all jobs. You can also adjust the work schedule by extending hours or enacting emergency 24-hour shifts. These laws understandably reduce the hope and raise the discontent of the general population. Not producing enough food for the city. Consider signing the soup or sawdust law. These unlock recipes which allow cooks to produce more food rations from raw food than standard meals. Maybe there's too many sick people and not enough patient beds. Well, sign the overcrowding law to force more patients to recover at once. And for more extreme measures, enact triage to sacrifice the severely ill at the cost of healing those who can recover quickly. For truly morbid desperation, dead bodies can be used to save those currently sick with the organ transplants law, or as organic fertilizer in hothouses. Meanwhile, you may have a bunch of terminally ill or crippled amputees that are sapping resources. Build a dedicated care house for them to keep them alive at a sensible cost. Maybe in the future you can enact the prosthetics law and make them useful again. As players progress further into each session, a new branch of laws will be available. The city has now adapted, but it is time to find purpose, and here the player can choose to pursue either the faith or order doctrines, deciding how best to reinvigorate hope into the people's future. The faith tree features laws and decrees aimed at reinstilling hope in the city by means of prayer and spirituality, such as building churches for evening mass or building shrines and field kitchens to inspire the workforce. The Order branch provides the city's purpose instead in discipline and unity, employing foremans to increase workplace efficiency, morning gatherings to outline the goals for the day, or employing guards and patrols to watch out for the community. Some of the later stages of these laws allow the player to pass certain checks that are impossible otherwise. For instance, having a body of faith keepers to act as a police force can help to crush riots or insurrections, whilst the lack thereof will embolden any dissenters. Although it may seem innocent, perhaps even trivial at first, these branches can evolve to something much more sinister. The player can push the faith branch into the extremes, forming a new religious cult with the player as the head, casting away non-believers and executing heretics. Or the creation of a new order with the player as a dictator, ruling with an iron fist, imprisoning traitors whilst culling the weak. If these extremes are implemented, hope will never become a problem again, but the moral price, well, that's up to the player. Researching new technologies and developing new ideas will be crucial to a city's survival. The technology tree is varied, with categories to upgrade the generator itself or improve heating effectiveness, allow exploration and advance industry, increase resource production, or improve the city's food, health, and living quarters infrastructure. Research is performed by engineers inside workshops, and the limited amount of engineers, coupled with the material cost of wood and steel, will dictate how fast improvements can get researched. Research is the only way to unlock some of the game's more advanced systems, which is almost required for survival. For instance, coal heaters or steam hubs are vital for any buildings outside the central generator range. Bunkhouses and houses provide much more insulation than the starting tents, an imperative for a healthy workforce. The factory is also obtained from research, which allows construction of prosthetics and automatons. A pivotal technology is the beacon. It is available early on, and once built, allows the city to view and venture forth into Frostland. Beacons are a guide point for any survivors or refugees. It lets the player see approaching storms or view localities in the surrounding region that can be explored. Scouts can be recruited to explore these places. There are often various wrecks or abandoned sites that can be scavenged to yield resources, or could be campsites of lost survivors which can be rescued and brought back to the city. Exploring Frostland is also one of the only few ways to obtain steam cores, the rarest resource in the game. They also provide many anecdotal snippets of world building that complements the game's rich lore. Some places can be discovered fitted with still working machinery or plentiful resources. These can be taken advantage of with the creation of the Outpost Depot, where teams can be recruited and sent to these locations, setting up an outpost and providing a periodic supply of material to the city, creating another method of obtaining resources. In some specific scenarios, entire settlements or cities can be discovered. Often they will form an integral part of the storyline, but if players purchase the On the Edge DLC, the settlements mechanic is expanded upon greatly and enabled for endless mode, allowing interaction with other colonies through trade and diplomacy mechanics. Exchange resources or do quests to garner favor, improve loyalty with settlements, which may provide useful aid in desperate times. Furthermore, interacting with settlements expands the lore of Frostland further, with each having backstories related to the greater universe of Frostpunk. It wouldn't be steampunk without giant towering metal robots. Automatons are an alternative labor source in Frostpunk. Their resistance to the cold and ability to work round the clock makes them a lucrative replacement for workforce, and further enhancements in the technology tree can allow them to work more efficiently or be used at workshops, factories, and health facilities. They are, however, expensive and requires coal, wood, steel, and a steam core to produce. Some automatons can also be found in Frostland and sent back to the city. Regardless, automatons open up interesting possibilities for late game optimization, not to mention their own host of storied content. As scenarios progress, or when certain conditions are met, Frostpunk triggers a variety of events and dilemmas that develop the game's emphasis on moral questioning. There is rarely a straight right or wrong answer, and players have to live with the consequences, intended or not. Remember that emergency shift you ordered because your city desperately needed more wood? Yeah, well, now somebody just overworked themselves to death. Maybe you decided to not force child labor in your city and instead build shelters for them. The people commend you later in a letter of thanks, raising their hope. The consequences of decisions may play out instantly, such as taking a risk to scavenge more material, or choosing to fight polar bears attacking a group of survivors. Otherwise, their consequences may develop much later on, such as not respecting a seemingly harmless omen early on in the scenario, only for it to come and bite back later. There is also a great deal of carving out tales of individuals within your city. For instance, once I decided to force an amputation on a frightened patient, who most certainly would have died because of the gangrene building up in his leg. He committed suicide later on as he felt his life no longer served any purpose. In another scenario, a group of amputees approached me requesting some wood to fashion some simple prosthesis to help out in the cookhouse, raising its efficiency. Scenarios will also feature major morally ambiguous decisions that drastically change how the storyline pans out and affects which ending you get. Frostpunk is just so deep in its events and dilemma system. The idea of unintended consequences really challenges players to hope for the right decision, even when the right answers aren't obvious. What's more, decisions carry weight and persist for the rest of the session, forcing players to deal with their choices regardless. Throw in some random chance and procedurally generated triggers, and Frostpunk presents players with unique, highly replayable gameplay experiences every session, even if they are repeating the same scenario. It also heavily questions the player's morality. There is a constant tug of war between progress and keeping everyone alive. In this cold and desolate land where the people have already given up so much, how much more are you willing to sacrifice? Will you be a utilitarian who values human life above all else, or a duty-bound leader that will save civilization at any cost? The gameplay elements speak for themselves, but the writing elevates the game's forced decision-making to an unprecedented emotional level. Frostpunk has one of the most interesting, well-crafted and thematic scenarios in any game, but they also deliver a certain gravitas, a crushing moral lesson, and thought-provoking consequences that will linger long after the player is done. Each scenario follows a different microcosm of the Frostpunk universe, but generally revolves around the British Empire, its people, and its institutions during the Great Frost. A New Home is Frostpunk's main campaign, and offers a polished vanilla experience as well as a pseudo-tutorial to teach the player the main aspects of gameplay. The story covers the recent arrival of a refugee convoy to New London, a generator settlement designated for survivors escaping from London during the Great Frost. Players are guided through the opening stages of building up a city, whilst attempting to search for lost colonists of the convoy broken up by a blizzard. The story progresses into Act 2 as the settlement attempts to reach out to find Winterhome, a city that had been well established before the Great Frost and capable of providing assistance to the new colonist. However, things aren't as they seem, and the hopes of the New London survivors are quickly dashed. What's more, there is a fierce impending threat brewing on the horizon, and the climax of A New Home exposes the true difficult nature of Frostpunk and really tests the player's strategic skill and their mental fortitude. Take solace in the fact that I had to replay this mission many times when I first played Frostpunk. Newer players will go through a similar baptism of fire. The second vanilla scenario is the Arks. A group of scientists and engineers from Britain's finest universities have been selected to safeguard seeds and seedlings from all over the world to ensure that the green earth will be reborn after the long winter ends, however long that may be. With a limited workforce, the gameplay of this scenario is centered around automatons, and the player will have to construct and upgrade them, as well as find and repair those found outside in Frostland. Furthermore, heat is a persistent problem as the seeds are very sensitive to the cold, whilst the Arks themselves sit some distance from the central generator. However, the Ark scenario drifts away from its initial simple premise, as a nearby generator settlement is struggling to survive, and the player will be forced again to make a huge moral decision. Bound by obligation to protect the seeds of the earth first and foremost, whether or not the player decides to help this dying city or how much resources and effort needs to be diverted is completely up to them. The Refugees is one of my favourite scenarios, and sees the common folk of London, who were condemned to die as the Great Frost came in, rise up and commandeer the ships that carried the wealthy to safety. As a result, they claim the generator site as their own, determined to forge their own destiny. Unlike in A New Home, refugees are constantly streaming into the city, most of them hungry and sick, and it's a literal race against time to get them treated and accommodated. What's more, the lords are not out of the equation, and they are also approaching the city, and the player and their inhabitants will have to face them eventually. This scenario will see the player tackle the issue of overpopulation, putting a massive strain on their food, housing and health infrastructure, whilst trying to resolve themes of class struggle and social conflict. The Fall of Winterhome was added to the base game as a free DLC in September 2018 and acts as a prequel to the A New Home scenario. Winterhome is in a tragic state as the generator is malfunctioning and the people have just revolted against their previous tyrannical ruler, burning down half the city in a violent civil war. The new leader is thrust into a pre-built but poorly planned city and must work against the clock to clear the rubble, rebuild hope and lower discontent before the generator state is irreversible. As such, this scenario is very different from the previous three, the player having inherited a already large city with laws already signed and most research options already unlocked, but in a dire state of affairs. The Fall of Winterhome also has arguably the most testing late game, and I won't spoil too much, but also the most gripping emotional arc. This scenario is very difficult and you'll be replaying it plenty of times to try to get the good ending, but it's also an extremely rewarding scenario and indicative of the type of moral examination Frostpunk does so well. The Last Autumn was released as a separate DLC in January 2020 and is a prequel to the entire game, set in the final autumn season before the Great Frost occurred. Here the story centers around Site 113, a site chosen by the British Empire to house a generator for potential evacuants from the city of Liverpool. Instead of trying to save people, this scenario is a race against the arriving Great Frost to complete the construction of a generator, and thus diverges mechanically from the rest of the game. Instead of hope, the player has to keep motivation high. There are new buildings, laws, and a story arc about assembling the different stages and components of the generator. Yet it isn't as straightforward. It never is, as fundamental design flaws coupled with unexpected happenings will hamper progress and require adept micromanagement. This scenario also explores the context of the world in greater detail, as there will be interactions with other generator construction sites, the homeland which is slowly destabilizing as the effects of changing climate grip the empire, and even other world powers as they are also frantically trying to save their own people as the cold is coming. The Last Autumn's mood and undertone is also significantly different from the rest of the game, portraying a much more hopeful, reassuring future for the world, despite its imminent plunge into the Great Frost.
The generator is operational. It's operational!
On the Edge is the final scenario and DLC, released in August of 2020. It is a sequel to A New Home, when an unspecified amount of time into the future, an army warehouse built before the Great Frost has been uncovered near New London. As the leader of a team sent to collect these resources, the player has to maintain an outpost without one of the key gameplay elements, a generator. Resources are also scarce around this escarpment, and the outpost is entirely dependent on food supplies from New London. Hardships within that city begin to have a knock-on effect that forces the player to question their loyalty and possibly dream of their independence. Furthermore, the discovery of other settlements opens up unique mechanics such as trading and diplomacy, and an opportunity to assist other survivors in Frostland in exchange for much needed resources. On the Edge refreshingly expands intercity dynamics, something lacking in the base game, but in my opinion falls short in its emotional impact and strength of its climactic conclusion. Finally, players have the option to embark upon an endless scenario, essentially the game's sandbox mode with no set victory conditions. The player can choose one of three modes: Serenity, Builders, or Endurance mode. Serenity is for a casual sandbox experience with relaxed conditions, plenty of resources, and subdued blizzards, whilst Endurance mode features a difficult start with scarce resources and terrible weather. The Builders mode is added in the Last Autumn DLC and requires repairing the starting generator first, using mechanics introduced by that DLC. Players can also choose a variety of maps that each have their own limitations or advantages. Some of these maps are based off of story scenarios as well. Importantly, there is still room for storied content, especially as the player can explore some of the new sectors of Frostland in the endless only maps, but of course there is no major story arc the player goes through. There's still tons of exclusive world building, provided through the Archives mission sequence where the player can search for lost relics of old civilization to display. Endless mode is an okay diversion for experimentation and lore hunting, but otherwise doesn't hold a candle to the scenarios. This does limit the overall replayability of Frostpunk. Frostpunk has received decent support post-release from the developers, though much of the paid DLCs haven't been received well at all, and it's easy to see why if we break it down. Firstly, there was a huge gap between release and paid DLC content, with the Season Pass bundle releasing more than a year later. The game did receive numerous updates, the free DLC that added Endless Mode, and the free scenario, The Fall of Winterhome, during this time however. This means that most of the hype around the game essentially fizzled out by the time of the Season Pass's announcement. The first DLC, The Rifts, was almost a total waste of money and time since it added just a single endless mode map with some specialized caveats, nothing to write home about. The next two DLCs featured unique scenarios and were much more fleshier and fresh in content. The last Autumn DLC is probably the best of the Pale DLCs, my personal favourite, as it explores a prequel setting with lots of world building and contextual storytelling, not to mention a gameplay experience around building the generators. On the Edge, however, was very niche in its story scope and in my opinion could have been used to give a satisfying ending to the saga of New London, but fell really short in its writing and conclusion. As a result, Frostpunk's Season Pass is disappointing in its mediocrity, although it isn't necessarily bad and should be considered by those heavily invested in the game. None of the DLC I would put as essential, however. For a game with roots in city building, mod support should be a given, but unfortunately the developers have not made that possible, and coupled with the relatively small scene surrounding the game, there is little hope in this regard. With the developers ending support in late 2020 with their final DLC release, final updates, and the conclusive Game of the Year edition, there's also no future prospects for the game. It seems Frostpunk was always intended to be this small indie project, and ultimately a waste of such an interesting premise and setting that could have been expanded upon further. This is one of the most interesting blends of steampunk and post-apocalypse. The game's city building mechanics that grid to concentric circles around a generator is an unusual but refreshing take on the genre. Frostpunk's universe at large is also well written and encourages players to explore further to learn the lore. 9 out of 10. A polished, stable game that can run on most systems, Frostpunk's UI, music and sound complements the game's immersive atmosphere of dread and desperation to a T, though the endless snow provides little respite from the visual repetition. It's surprising sometimes to remember this game is essentially an indie project by a small development studio. 7 out of 10. Deep in its mechanics and audacious in its execution, Frostpunk is a city builder about survival first and foremost, thus its resource management and optimization aspects are deliberately relevant. The game is very difficult however, and its recurring race against the clock mission design won't be everyone's cup of tea. 8 out of 10. A breadth of different settings present the player with varied circumstances, each scenario ascending into a well-crafted climax before cascading into a grandiose finale, all while respecting the choices matter motto. Dilemmas are filled with moral ambiguity, and the consequences of one's action culminates into an emotionally impactful experience. 9 out of 10. Frostpunk's compelling setting is not expanded thoroughly enough with its paid DLC releases, and ultimately doesn't provide a satisfying conclusion to the saga, though the free DLCs have been very decent. There's a feeling that the developers only just scratched the surface of the lore, despite how the game turned out. Lack of modding support essentially means the game's future rests solely in a sequel. 5 out of 10. Overall, I give Frostpunk a final weighted score of 8 out of 10. Frostpunk's base game currently runs for a price of $29.99 on Steam, despite being unchanged since release. This is a pretty fair price for a game that will provide at least 30 to 40 hours of playtime through just its scenarios. Unfortunately, due to the nature of Frostpunk's limited scope and emphasis on story content, there is little in the way of replayability for most players, though people who do enjoy the game's lore will definitely get more mileage. Since release though, Frostpunk has been on sale virtually every 1 or 2 months with major discounts during Steam's seasonal store-wide sales. The Rifts DLC adds an endless mode map that features new gameplay mechanics such as bridge building. Its limited space map design is meant for advanced players, but since endless mode is Frostpunk's weaker game mode, I recommend skipping this DLC unless this mode specifically interests you. It's not a bad DLC for its price though. The Last Autumn DLC introduces a new scenario set in a prequel environment not yet covered by snow. It's not only a different aesthetic change, but a massive gameplay change, tasked with building a generator. I actually like this DLC a lot as I'm a sucker for expansive world building, and this DLC provides the context of the greater world at large before the Great Frost. The DLC also adds the builders setting in endless mode, but overall I think it's slightly overpriced, but is still a great extension of the base game experience. The third and final expansion is On the Edge, which adds a scenario centered around a breakaway outpost. Lack of a generator and scant resources marks the unique gameplay experience, as well as the addition of trade and diplomacy with the new settlements feature, which is also enabled into endless mode. Decent, but honestly this scenario was boring, and for the final expansion I was expecting some sort of conclusive end to the story. Frostpunk's Season Pass includes all of the previous 3 DLCs as well as the free art book and soundtrack, giving a 30% overall discount at $24.47, making the price quite respectable. The best value, however, can be found with Frostpunk's Game of the Year edition, which includes the base game and the Season Pass, further adding a 15% discount on top of everything. Despite the overpricings and criticism of the individual DLCs, this bundle presents the definitive Frostpunk collection at a very worthwhile price point, and thus deserves consideration. Furthermore, this bundle will be further discounted during Steam's seasonal sales. Frostpunk is the sort of game that is absorbing in its experience and thought-provoking in its impact, subject matters that are usually associated with story-driven RPGs or dramas. It's a testament to the writing and setting of Frostpunk that a city-building, resource management game can pull off such splendid storytelling. Like This War of Mine, this game is a relatively unknown indie gem, but proves that you can deliver a memorable experience with simulation games despite its small scope. Conclusively, it is of my opinion that Frostpunk delivers the best campaign of any city builder, a historical weak point with this genre. This was Frostpunk, the Game of the Year Edition review. Thanks to our patrons for funding the creation of this video. You too can support the channel by subscribing on Patreon for as little as $1 a month.